The Canon RF 600mm f4 LIS lens is certainly a very impressive and excellent lens for wildlife photography, and especially for bird photography if you're often chasing after some smaller and shyer birds, because it also takes the tele-extenders extremely well. However, it's quite large, as you can see, and it's quite pricey. It costs almost 13,000 US dollars. In Europe, the prices vary a bit, but they are usually around 14,500 euros. And I bought this lens around 1.5 years ago before I went to Costa Rica, and it has been my most expensive lens purchase, or actually my most expensive purchase in my whole life. I've never bought something as expensive as that. And after using it for 1.5 years, also traveling to many different places, taking hundreds of thousands of pictures with this lens, I want to talk about my experiences. Was it worth the money? What do I like about it? What are my dislikes? And if you are like I was before, using a EF 600mm f4 LIS of the second generation, is it worth the upgrade? Or if you're looking for a new 600mm f4 because maybe you're using a zoom lens right now and you want to make this switch to this fast prime lens, does it make sense to spend the money here, or should you rather go for a used EF lens? I will cover all that in the video. Before we talk about the features and the handling of this lens, I first want to clarify the terminology that I will use from here on forward. I will call the EF 600mm f4 LIS USM of the second generation just EF 600mm of the second generation, and the RF 600mm f4 LIS USM just RF 600mm, just to make it a bit simpler, but I hope this is okay for you. So about this lens, the first time I picked it up, I was surprised how light it actually is, and I've got similar feedback from other people that took it in their hands for the first time. Somehow you expect it to be heavier. It's still not very lightweight. It's a bit over 3 kilo, 3.09 kilograms to be precise. But compared to the lens I was coming from, the EF 600mm f4 of the second generation, this was around 850 grams lighter, and that's quite a big difference. And what I also noticed when handling immediately is that the weight is somehow closer to the camera body, and this makes it feel even lighter. Another thing that I really like about this lens is the position of the focus ring. In my opinion, it's in the perfect position. I can very easily turn it here. I found this always a bit annoying with the Nikon super telephoto lenses. Otherwise, you have basically everything you would expect with a lens, fast telephoto lens like this one. You have this ring here to recall the focus position. You can recall 2 different positions. You have the 4 lens function buttons around here. You have a drop-in filter that I never used, and then on the other side you have some switches for the autofocus, manual focus, focus preset, focus limiter, stabilizer and stabilizer mode. What I like about the tripod collar is that you have a small click when you rotate it every time you hit basically 90 degrees or 180 degrees, 270 degrees. So if I rotate it here, you hear maybe, I like this small click. I'm not sure if you hear it on the video, but there is a small click and some feedback that I actually enjoy. Otherwise, what I don't like so much about the lens is just the length. Of course, the diameter is also quite big, but this is a given with a 600mm f4 lens. That's just physics. But if we look at Nikon and Sony, how their 600mm f4 look like, they are considerably shorter. And I think it's because both of these lenses were designed for mirrorless cameras, whereas this one is, in terms of the optics that is inside, basically EF 600mm f4 of the third generation with an integrated EF RF adapter. It still has some advantages over the other lens. I will talk about this in a minute, but this explains why it's a rather large lens. We have a minimum focus distance of 4.2 meters, which is also quite a good value. Of course, if you're coming from an RF 100 to 500 or another zoom lens, this 4.2 meters might sound like a lot, but it's quite standard with these big 600mm f4 lenses. So let's move to image quality. I don't need to say much here because the image quality of this lens is good and it better be for the price. It also works very well with the 1.4 extender, and even with the 2x extender I was sometimes very happy with the results. Sometimes I had a bit mixed feelings. This always depends on the situation. If you really want to pixel peep, the EF 600mm f4 of the second generation was actually slightly sharper, especially when using tele extenders and going more to the edge or the corner of the frame. But in reality, I never saw a difference. When I was just shooting, I could not have said this one looks sharper. It's the RF version, the EF version, and this is slightly softer. It's the RF version. It looks tag sharp. And I think if I'm not happy with the sharpness, it is for other reasons, either because I missed focus, I was shaking the camera a bit too much, or maybe there was just too much heat haze or fog between me and my subject. But the lens really delivers an image quality, again, as we can expect for that price. What I realized when I switched from the EF 600mm f4 of the second generation to the RF 600mm f4 is that the autofocus has been improved. I think one of the first times I took it out, I was taking pictures of bee eaters and of kestrels, and I felt like when the kestrels were taking off, I just got more keepers with this lens than I did with my old EF 600mm f4. One thing that I want to mention here is that the RF 600mm f4 still uses the ring ultrasonic motor, and this means if you focus you can actually hear it a bit. I will take it close to the microphone and maybe you can hear it. So the first sound that you heard before was actually when the image stabilizer got activated, and afterwards, just every time I press the shutter button, you probably heard the autofocus motor moving. It's not terrible. I don't think it will scare any bird off or anything, but it is noticeable. And an RF 100 to 300 2.8 that has a dual nano USM motor is just much more quiet. One of the main reasons I upgraded to this lens, as I mentioned, it was just before my trip to Costa Rica. Of course it was the weight, but especially the image stabilizer, because I knew that in the dark rainforest I would be happy to being able to handhold a longer shutter speed. And the image stabilizer in this lens is just phenomenal. So I did some tests at home. I actually used the 1.4 extender, so I had 840 millimeters in total. And then I took some test shots at 1/60th of a second. And with my old EF 600mm f4 of the second generation, I had around 10% of sharp images. With the RF 600mm f4, I had around 60% of sharp images. That's a factor of 6 times more sharp images. And if the bird stays there for a long time, it doesn't matter so much. But if the bird only stays there for a second, or maybe even less, and you really don't have a lot of time, this can make a big difference. Obviously, the subject kind of needs to cooperate. It doesn't work on like flying animals or any animals that are moving, but sometimes you have some animals, some songbirds, some owls, some herons that don't move at all for a while, and then you can really increase your shutter speed if you're in these more low light situations to still get a sharp image and keep the ISO at a like reasonable level. I also had the impression that the image stabilizer was working even better with the new Canon cameras, namely the R5 Mark II, and I did a test with the R1. So I just used the 600mm f4 without converter this time, and I took some shots at 1/5 of a second. 1/5 of a second. And I got still several sharp images. I was surprised. I don't know the percentage, it was not a very scientific test, but several sharp images at 1/5 of a second at 600mm. I was very impressed. And it's not only important that you can go down to 1/5 of a second, but sometimes you're also in a less stable position because you might need a special angle, or you're taking pictures from a moving boat, or sometimes in winter I'm hiking with my snowshoes. I do some like 100-200 meters of elevation, and immediately after I see a chamois, I take out the lens and I fire away, and my heartbeat is so high, I'm not in a very stable position. Maybe I have an awkward shooting position on top of that. And then even a 500th of a second can be a gamble if you get sharp images or not. And here a lens with a really good image stabilizer certainly helps. As you can see, I have here like a protection on top of it. I have a different lens foot, I have a different lens cap. I did a video about all these other things that I use in combination with this lens, and I put the description to this video, or a link to this video, and I also put the link to the products in the video description in case you are interested. So what are my conclusions? How happy am I with the lens? What do I not like? Maybe you already heard it. My biggest point of critique would be that it feels like only half of an RF lens, like a mixture between EF and RF lens. Like better than the EF 600mm f4 of the third generation, which again the optical formula is the same and the weight is basically the same. It has some benefits over this, like a slightly improved image stabilizer. The autofocus I think should be a bit better, but it's quite long. You still have this ring ultrasonic motor that makes a bit of sound. Maybe you notice there is no like control ring like we have it with many other RF lenses. So I would be happy if there would maybe also come a completely redesigned RF lens at some point in the future. I need to give it to Canon, or need to give credit to Canon that they didn't increase the price of this lens when they released it. So the EF version costs the same as this one. And this also means that I think now I would really not buy the EF version 3 of the lens, because you don't save so much money, except if you find a really good used offer, but otherwise you don't save so much money. And with this one here you have some benefits and you're definitely more future-proof. The EF 600mm f4 of the second generation, on the other side, can be very interesting because you can find very good offers of used lenses. As I mentioned, the image quality is excellent. It's in some regards even better than this one. Autofocus is still very good. Image stabilizer is still okay for most situations. It also depends how much you handhold. I think I would not go for the EF 600mm f4 of the first generation, because the image stabilizer of this first generation of super telephoto lenses was really not so good. Autofocus was also a bit weaker and they were super heavy. I think the first generation was around 5.4 kilograms, and that's really a lot. So unless you shoot basically all the time from a height, I would really save a bit more money and then go for a second generation glass. Let me know if you're also using one of the 600mm f4, if you maybe upgraded to this one, what your experiences are. Let me know in the comments, and see you in the next video.